Steve Jobs changed the world 3 times. First, he put a personal computer in every home with the Apple II. Then he revolutionized animated films through Pixar, creating Toy Story and a new era of digital animation. Finally, he transformed how billions of people live with the iPod, iPhone, and iPad, devices that now define modern life. Kicked out of his own company at 30, he came back to build Apple into the world's most valuable business. The college dropout who started in a garage became the visionary who proved that beautiful design and simple technology could change everything. But how did an adopted boy from California become one of the most influential people in history? This is the story of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, California. His biological parents were 2 young college students, a Syrian political science student and a Catholic woman of Swiss-German descent. They were only 23 years old and unmarried. The woman's father threatened to cut her off if she married her boyfriend, so she traveled to San Francisco alone to have the baby and give him up for adoption. The baby was supposed to go to a lawyer and his wife, but they changed their minds when they found out it was a boy. They wanted a girl. Instead, the baby went to Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul was a mechanic who had served in the Coast Guard during World War II. Clara was the daughter of Armenian immigrants. They named the baby Stephen Paul Jobs. The biological mother almost didn't sign the adoption papers. She only agreed after Paul and Clara promised to save money for the boy's college education. Ironically, she didn't need to give up her baby at all. After her father died a few months later, she married her boyfriend anyway and had a daughter named Mona. But by then, Steve was already with his new family. From an early age, Steve knew he was adopted. Some people think this made him feel abandoned and drove him to prove himself. But Jobs always said his adoptive parents made him feel completely loved, like their real child. When Steve was young, the Jobs family moved to Mountain View, California, right in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley. Their neighborhood was full of engineers working for defense contractors and technology companies. The area was exploding with innovation as the computer industry began to grow. Paul Jobs set up a workshop in the garage where he fixed and sold used cars. Although Steve wasn't very interested in car mechanics, he loved electronics. Father and son worked on small electrical projects together. Paul taught Steve that even the parts you couldn't see should be made well, a lesson Steve never forgot. Steve was a smart kid, but easily bored. At school, he found the lessons too simple and spent his time playing pranks instead. When teachers complained, Paul and Clara refused to blame their son. They blamed the school for not challenging him enough. Everything changed when Steve was around 10 years old. His 4th grade teacher, Imogene Hill, figured out how to motivate him. She bribed him with candy and $5 bills to do extra homework. It worked! By the end of that year, Steve had learned so much that the school wanted him to skip 2 grades. His parents agreed to let him skip just 1. The next school was in a rough neighborhood with gang violence. Steve told his parents he wouldn't go back. So Paul and Clara moved the whole family to a better area so Steve could attend Cupertino Junior High, one of the best schools around. This sacrifice showed how much they believed in their son. At Homestead High School, Steve became interested in electronics and music. He also tried psychedelic drugs with older friends. He was still mischievous. Once his father got angry when Steve wired the house with hidden speakers so he could spy on his parents' conversations. A neighbor who worked for Hewlett-Packard invited Steve to join the HP Explorers Club, where students met with engineers to learn about new projects. Steve was fascinated by the computers HP was developing. When he needed parts for a project he was building, the teenage Jobs found the CEO's phone number in the phone book and called him directly. The CEO, Bill Hewlett, was so impressed that he not only gave Jobs the parts, but offered him a summer job. The most important moment came when Steve met Steve Wozniak in 1971. Wozniak was 5 years older and already a brilliant engineer. Despite the age difference, the two Steves became best friends. They shared a love of electronics, music, and mischief. Their first business venture was completely illegal. They learned that hackers were using devices called blue boxes to make free long-distance phone calls by tricking the phone system. Wozniak built a digital version, and Jobs suggested they sell them. They made about 100 blue boxes, selling them for $150 each, until a customer pulled a gun on them and they decided to quit. This partnership taught them something important. Wozniak was a genius at building things, and Jobs was a genius at selling them. It was a combination that would change the world. After high school, Jobs went to Reed College in Oregon, one of the most expensive schools in America. He loved the hippie atmosphere and became interested in Zen Buddhism and vegetarianism. But he felt guilty about wasting his parents' money on required classes that didn't interest him. So, after 6 months, he dropped out. Jobs returned to California and got a job at Atari, the video game company famous for Pong. He usually worked the night shift because his coworkers didn't like his hygiene and attitude. But he made friends with Ron Wayne, one of Atari's designers, who had tried to start his own business before. A few months later, Jobs went to India, looking for spiritual enlightenment. He came back 7 months later with his head shaved, wearing Indian robes, and much thinner after getting sick from bad water. His parents barely recognized him when they picked him up at the airport. Jobs continued practicing Zen Buddhism for the rest of his life. He attended meditation sessions with a Japanese Zen master. This spiritual side of Jobs might seem strange for someone who became a tech billionaire, but it shaped his design philosophy. He believed in simplicity, focus, and removing everything unnecessary. In 1975, Wozniak started attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club, where hobbyists gathered to talk about early personal computers. Wozniak saw a new machine called the Altair 8800 and got inspired. He decided to build his own computer using a cheap processor chip. For 4 months, Wozniak worked on his computer every evening after his day job at HP. On June 29, 1975, he successfully tested it. The computer displayed text on a screen. It was revolutionary. Wozniak was happy to give away his designs for free so others could build their own. But Jobs saw something bigger. He convinced Wozniak they should build circuit boards and sell them. They scraped together $1,300 to start a business. Jobs suggested calling it Apple Computer, partly because he was eating a lot of apples on his fruit diet, and partly because Apple would appear before Atari in the phone book. On April 1, 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak officially founded Apple Computer. They brought in Ron Wayne, who helped write the partnership agreement and got a 10% stake. But Wayne got nervous and pulled out less than 2 weeks later, selling his share for $800. Decades later, that stake would have been worth billions of dollars. One of the worst financial decisions in history. Jobs and Wozniak presented their computer to the Homebrew Computer Club, but most people weren't impressed. However, Paul Terrell, who owned a computer store called the Byte Shop, saw potential. He told Jobs he would buy 50 computers, but only if they were fully assembled, not just circuit boards. This was a huge order. Jobs and Wozniak needed $15,000 to buy parts. Jobs convinced an electronics store manager to give them 30 days of credit by having him call Terrell to confirm the order. Then they frantically assembled 50 computers in Jobs' parents' garage. They delivered the computers on time, though Terrell was surprised they didn't include a case, monitor, or keyboard. Still, he paid them as promised. They called their product the Apple One and sold about 200 of them total. By then, Wozniak was already working on the Apple II, a complete computer with an integrated case and keyboard. Jobs obsessed over the design, creating a sleek plastic case. To raise money, they tried to sell the company to larger businesses. Jobs even offered Atari founder Nolan Bushnell a third of Apple for $50,000. Bushnell refused, a decision he deeply regretted later. Instead, Bushnell introduced Jobs to investors. Mike Markkula, a former Intel employee who had become a millionaire, saw Apple's potential. He invested $250,000 and helped them incorporate Apple Incorporated on January 3, 1977. Markkula became Jobs' mentor, teaching him marketing principles. Understand your customers, focus on your best products, and present everything professionally. The Apple II launched in April 1977 and became a massive success. Almost 6 million were sold over the next 16 years. Apple went from a garage startup to a real company. As Apple grew, Jobs struggled with management. He could be incredibly rude to employees. He also made terrible personal decisions. His on-again, off-again girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan, got pregnant in 1977. Jobs claimed he wasn't the father and pressured her to have an abortion. She refused and gave birth to a daughter named Lisa in May 1978. Jobs denied being the father for years, even after a paternity test proved it. He eventually paid child support and later admitted he had handled it badly. But this showed a dark side of Jobs' personality. He could be cruel and lacked empathy. When Apple went public in December 1980, Jobs became worth $256 million overnight at age 25. About 300 other people became millionaires too. But Jobs refused to share his wealth with some early Apple employees who had helped build the company. His old friend Daniel Kotke, who had traveled to India with him, got nothing from Jobs. It was Wozniak who generously shared his own stock with early employees, showing he was the kinder of the two Steves. Meanwhile, Jobs wanted Apple to create something truly revolutionary. The answer came from an unlikely source, Xerox. Xerox's venture capital division invested $1 million in Apple. In return, they agreed to show Jobs their research lab in Palo Alto. In December 1979, Jobs and several Apple engineers visited Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. What Jobs saw there amazed him. Xerox had invented a computer with a graphical user interface. Instead of typing text commands, you could use a mouse to point and click on icons and windows on the screen. You could move things around, open files by clicking on them, and see everything displayed visually. This was revolutionary. Every computer at the time required users to memorize and type complex commands. But Xerox's system was intuitive. Anyone could use it. The incredible thing was that Xerox didn't realize what they had. Their executives in Connecticut paid little attention to this breakthrough, but Jobs saw it immediately. This was the future of computing. "Why aren't you doing anything with this?" Jobs asked, amazed. "This is the future." Jobs rushed back to Apple and told his team, "We need to build this, and we need to make it even better than what Xerox has." Apple got to work. Jobs took over a project called the Macintosh, named after a type of apple. He assembled the best team he could find, even stealing talented engineers from other Apple projects and from Xerox itself. Jobs obsessed over every tiny detail of the Macintosh. He had strong opinions about everything. The computer case should be no bigger than a phone book. All the dialog boxes and windows must have rounded corners, not sharp edges. The fonts needed to be beautiful. He hired a typography expert to design multiple typefaces. His design team often got frustrated by his demands for tiny changes. Why did it matter if a corner was perfectly rounded? Jobs would tell them, "Users are going to be looking at this screen every single day. It has to be perfect. It has to be beautiful." Jobs also revolutionized how the Mac looked inside. He insisted that even the circuit boards should be elegant, even though users would never see them. His engineers thought he was crazy. "Nobody will ever look inside," they protested. "I'll know," Jobs replied. His adoptive father, Paul, had taught him that true craftsmen care about quality, even in the parts no one sees. Jobs became famous, or infamous, for his management style during the Mac project. He divided the world into two categories. Things were either brilliant or shit. There was no middle ground. He could call your idea terrible one day, then present it as his own brilliant idea the next day, seemingly forgetting you had suggested it. He set impossible deadlines that seemed crazy, and his team somehow always met them. He created what people called a reality distortion field. He was so convinced something could be done that he convinced everyone else too, making the impossible possible. People either loved working for Jobs or hated it. Some couldn't stand him and quit. Others found him inspiring and did the best work of their lives. His team worked insane hours, but they felt like they were changing the world. Jobs knew the Mac launch had to be spectacular. Apple's previous computer, the Lisa, had flopped despite being innovative. The Apple II was now old technology, and IBM was dominating the PC market with boring but practical computers. Jobs authorized a $1.5 million Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott, who had just made Blade Runner. The ad showed a dystopian future inspired by George Orwell's novel 1984, with rows of mindless workers watching a Big Brother figure on a giant screen. Then a woman in bright colors runs in and throws a hammer at the screen, smashing it. The tagline. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The message was clear. IBM was the boring corporate big brother, and Apple was the rebel fighting for freedom. Most marketing experts at Apple thought the ad was terrible and wouldn't work. But Jobs loved it. The commercial aired during the Super Bowl on January 22, 1984, and became one of the most famous ads in history. People talked about it for weeks. 2 days later, on January 24, 1984, Jobs unveiled the Macintosh at Apple's shareholders' meeting. He walked on stage, reached into a bag, and pulled out the compact Mac. Then, in a moment of pure showmanship, he stepped back and let the computer introduce itself. Using a speech synthesis feature that engineers had developed just days before, the Mac spoke, "Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag." The audience went wild. Jobs had done it again. He'd created not just a product, but an experience, a moment that people would remember forever. This was Steve Jobs at his best. The perfectionist designer, the demanding boss, the brilliant marketer, and the master showman, all combined into one. Despite the exciting launch, Mac sales soon disappointed. The computer was expensive, underpowered, and prone to overheating. Meanwhile, Jobs' relationship with Apple's CEO John Sculley fell apart. Both men plotted to remove the other. In the showdown, the Apple board sided with Sculley. In September 1985, at age 30, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had founded. He was devastated. But Jobs wasn't finished. He started a new computer company called Next, determined to build the best computer ever made. He also bought a struggling animation studio from George Lucas for $10 million. The studio was called Pixar. Next was supposed to be Jobs' big comeback. He put all his energy into building what he called the perfect computer. True to form, Jobs obsessed over design. The Next computer was a beautiful black cube with no visible screws. It could record and play high-quality audio and came loaded with digital books. Jobs spared no expense. He spent $100,000 just designing the logo. He hired famous designer Paul Rand, who had created the IBM and ABC logos. He built an automated factory that cost millions of dollars to manufacture the computers. When Jobs unveiled the Next computer in October 1988 at a concert hall in San Francisco, it was another masterpiece of showmanship. He spent 2 hours presenting the computer like it was a work of art. The audience loved the presentation. Then Jobs announced the price, $6,500. The audience gasped. He had done it again, created something beautiful but far too expensive for most people. Jobs had hoped to sell 10,000 computers per month. Instead, Next sold only about 400 per month. It was a commercial disaster. But the Next computer would end up changing the world in an unexpected way. The machine had a sophisticated operating system and powerful networking capabilities. In 1990, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN, the European Physics Research Center in Switzerland. He needed to create a way for scientists to share information easily. Berners-Lee chose a Next computer to develop his system. On it, he created the first web browser and web server, inventing the World Wide Web. The software that would eventually connect billions of people around the world was born on a Next computer. Jobs didn't know it at the time, but his failed computer had enabled one of the most important inventions in human history. Meanwhile, Jobs was also running Pixar, though at first he didn't pay much attention to the animation side. He had bought Pixar mainly for its computer technology. The company made expensive computer graphics systems for businesses and special effects studios. Pixar was bleeding money, losing millions of dollars each year. Jobs kept investing his own money to keep it alive, but he kept cutting staff and was close to shutting down the animation division entirely. Then something changed. Jobs started paying more attention to what the animators were doing. He met with John Lasseter, a talented animator who had been fired from Disney. Lasseter had a vision. He believed computers could be used to make full-length animated movies that would look better than anything done before. Jobs began to see the potential. He protected the animation team from budget cuts and gave them money to make a short film called Tin Toy in 1988. The 5-minute film told the story of a toy that comes to life. It was charming and funny. Tin Toy became the first computer-animated film to win an Academy Award. Suddenly, Hollywood noticed Pixar. Disney, which had dominated animation for decades but was struggling to stay relevant, wanted to partner with Pixar. They signed a deal to make a full-length feature film together. The movie would be called Toy Story. Jobs negotiated tough, but Disney had the upper hand. They got creative control and owned the characters. Pixar would only get 12.5% of the ticket sales. It seemed like a bad deal, but it was the only way to get the movie made. Making Toy Story took years and almost fell apart multiple times. In 1993, Disney executive Jeffrey Katzenberg kept pushing to make the main character Woody meaner and edgier. This killed the heart of the movie. Disney nearly canceled the project. Jobs helped convince Disney to let director John Lasseter go back to his original vision, a heartwarming story about toys that come to life when humans aren't around. Jobs also pushed hard on the technical side, making sure every frame looked perfect. Toy Story premiered in November 1995. Critics loved it. Families packed theaters. The movie eventually earned over $373 million worldwide, a massive hit. But Jobs pulled off his greatest business move yet. 1 week after Toy Story opened, he took Pixar public. The stock market went crazy for it. Shares priced at $22 shot up to $39 on the first day. Jobs owned 80% of Pixar, which was suddenly worth $1.2 billion. Steve Jobs, who had been kicked out of Apple and was running a failing computer company, was now a billionaire, and he had done it through animated toys. With his newfound wealth and leverage, Jobs renegotiated with Disney. The new deal was much better. Pixar and Disney would split costs and profits 50-50, and both companies would share credit equally. Over the next decade, Pixar would make hit after hit: A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, and Wall-E. Each movie pushed animation technology forward and told stories that moved both children and adults. Jobs had learned important lessons during these wilderness years. At Apple, he had been young and arrogant. At Next and Pixar, he learned patience, how to handle failure, and how to work with creative people. He also learned that sometimes the best strategy is to wait for the right moment. That moment was coming soon. Apple was in trouble, and they would need Steve Jobs to save them. During this difficult period, Jobs also reconnected with his biological family. After his adoptive mother, Clara, died in 1986, she told him more about his adoption. Jobs tracked down his biological mother, Joanne, who tearfully apologized for giving him up. He also met his biological sister, Mona Simpson, who became a successful novelist. They became close friends. Jobs learned that his biological father had once managed a restaurant near San Jose. Jobs remembered eating there and shaking hands with the owner, without realizing it was his own father. But Jobs refused to meet him, still angry about being given up for adoption. In 1989, Jobs met Laurene Powell, a Stanford business student. They married in March 1991 in a Zen ceremony. They moved to a modest house in Palo Alto and eventually had 3 children together, Reed, Aaron, and Eve. Jobs' first daughter, Lisa, also moved in with them during high school. Despite his early failures as a father, Jobs became a devoted family man. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive hit, earning over $360 million worldwide. 1 week after the premiere, Jobs took Pixar public. The stock soared from $22 to $39 on the first day. Jobs' 80% stake was suddenly worth $1.2 billion. Jobs had gone from being kicked out of Apple and running a failing computer company to becoming a billionaire through Pixar. It was an incredible comeback, but the greatest chapter was yet to come. By 1996, Apple was in trouble. The company was losing money and had no clear direction. In desperation, Apple's CEO bought Next for $400 million, bringing Jobs back as an advisor. Jobs maneuvered quietly to take control. Within months, he convinced the board to fire the CEO and appoint him as interim CEO. Jobs was back at Apple 12 years after being forced out. He immediately made dramatic changes. First, he shocked everyone by announcing a partnership with Microsoft, Apple's old rival. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple and agreed to keep making Office software for Mac. Many Apple fans felt betrayed, but the deal saved the company. Apple's stock jumped 33% in 1 day. Jobs also launched a new advertising campaign with the slogan, "Think Different," showing black and white photos of Albert Einstein, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and other rebels who changed the world. The message was clear. Apple was for people who dared to be different. Then Jobs did something radical. He looked at all the products Apple was making and cut most of them. He narrowed the entire company down to just 4 products: 2 desktop computers and 2 laptops, 1 for consumers and 1 for professionals. This focus transformed Apple. In May 1998, Jobs introduced the iMac, a desktop computer in a translucent blue case that looked like nothing else on the market. It was fun, friendly, and beautiful. The iMac became the fastest-selling computer in Apple's history. By January 2000, Apple was profitable again, and Jobs dropped the interim from his CEO title. In the late 1990s, millions of people started illegally downloading music from the internet. The music industry was in crisis. Jobs saw an opportunity. In January 2001, Apple launched iTunes, software that made it easy to organize and manage music on your computer. Then in November 2001, Jobs introduced the iPod, a portable music player that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. Everything about the iPod was different. At a time when most electronics were black, Jobs made the iPod, earphones, and cables all white. He eliminated the on/off switch. The device just went to sleep when you weren't using it. The interface was incredibly simple, with just a few buttons and a scroll wheel. Despite costing $399, the iPod became a huge hit. But Jobs wasn't done. In 2003, Apple opened the iTunes Store, where people could legally buy songs for 99 cents each. Within 1 week, Apple sold 1 million songs. Jobs had transformed the entire music industry. By 2004, Apple launched the iPod Mini and later the iPod Nano. Apple sold hundreds of millions of iPods and became the dominant force in portable music. Jobs even convinced the Beatles record label to sell their music on iTunes, something no one else had been able to do. In October 2003, a routine medical scan found a tumor on Jobs' pancreas. Pancreatic cancer is usually deadly because it's caught too late, but Jobs was lucky. His tumor was caught early and could be removed by surgery. Then Jobs made a terrible decision. He refused surgery and spent 9 months trying alternative medicine, special diets, herbal remedies, and other treatments. For a man whose entire career was built on science and technology, this was bizarre. By the time Jobs finally agreed to surgery in July 2004, the cancer had spread. While the operation was successful, doctors found that cancer cells had reached his liver. Jobs would spend the rest of his life fighting the disease. Jobs tried to keep his illness secret, but in June 2005, he gave a famous commencement speech at Stanford University where he talked about death. "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life," he said. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. It was one of the most powerful speeches ever given. Knowing his time was limited, Jobs worked harder than ever. He noticed that mobile phones were becoming cameras and music players, threatening the iPod's dominance. Apple needed to make a phone. Jobs decided it should use a touchscreen instead of a physical keyboard like the BlackBerry. The screen would be made of strong Gorilla Glass that wouldn't scratch. Users could swipe to unlock it, tap icons to open apps, and pinch to zoom photos. No phone had ever worked like this before. On January 9, 2007, Jobs walked on stage at Macworld in San Francisco. "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone," he announced. Then he showed the iPhone, a device that was a phone, an iPod, and an internet browser all in one. The audience went crazy. When the iPhone went on sale in June 2007 for $499, people lined up for hours to buy one. Despite the high price, it was a massive success. The iPhone changed everything. It created the smartphone revolution that transformed how billions of people communicate, work, shop, and live. Every touchscreen phone today is based on ideas Jobs pioneered with the iPhone. In 2010, Jobs introduced the iPad, a tablet computer that filled the gap between phones and laptops. Again, people weren't sure they needed it. Again, Jobs proved them wrong. Apple sold 1 million iPads in the first month. The App Store, launched in 2008, created a whole new industry. Developers could create apps that ran on iPhones and iPads, with Apple taking a 30% cut of sales. Hundreds of thousands of apps were created, and a new economy was born. But Jobs' health was failing. He had a liver transplant in 2009. He became painfully thin as the cancer spread. In January 2009, he took a medical leave. He came back to work but took another leave in 2011. Still, Jobs kept working. He appeared at events to launch new iPads. He met with President Obama. He worked on plans for a new Apple headquarters building. He even met with his old rival Bill Gates for a 3-hour conversation about life and technology. On August 24, 2011, Jobs resigned as Apple's CEO, naming Tim Cook as his successor. 6 weeks later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at his home in Palo Alto. He was 56 years old. Just 2 months before his death, Apple had become the most valuable company in the world. Steve Jobs didn't invent personal computers, digital music, smartphones, or tablets. But he made them simple, beautiful, and essential to our lives. Jobs was a complicated person. He could be cruel. He denied his daughter, refused to help old friends, and often took credit for other people's work. He could be impossible to work with, moody, demanding, and harsh. But he was also a true visionary. He understood that technology should serve people, not the other way around. He believed that simplicity was the ultimate sophistication. He proved that design wasn't just how something looked, but how it worked. Jobs changed the world 3 times. First with the personal computer revolution at Apple in the 1970s and 80s, then with the digital animation revolution at Pixar in the 1990s, and finally with the mobile revolution through the iPod, iPhone, and iPad in the 2000s. The boy who was given up for adoption, the college dropout who worked in his parents' garage, the CEO who was fired from his own company. He became one of the most influential people of the modern era. Every time you tap your smartphone screen, listen to music on your phone, or watch an animated movie, you're experiencing technology that Steve Jobs helped create. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world, Jobs once said in an Apple commercial, are the ones who do. Steve Jobs was that kind of crazy, and he changed the world.